Hey everybody, this is Ted. Welcome to our week 9 video discussion. So I wanted to start us off with a recap of last week. I think we begin with Michael Sandel's argument about the tyranny of meritocracy. And he's essentially arguing that meritocracy and to some extent the American dream work to legitimize inequality and create a toxic sorting culture within society. Pierre Bourdieu, on the other hand, basically kind of illustrates the ways in which that sort of game status can be rigged through the transmission of cultural and social capital. And finally, got a bit of a case study from John Thielen's article about the Varsity Blues scandal. And in it, he's basically arguing that legal systems of advantage create an affirmative action for the rich through these various country club sports like rowing and crew. Taken together, I think we can see that last week presented a pretty unified challenge to the narrative that your position in society is determined by the amount of effort you put in, and that social status can actually be reproduced between generations. This week, we're going to be asking the question, how does this reproduction actually happen? What are the daily on the ground processes that are going on in families and in classrooms that actually affect social mobility? Um, so I think to start us off, probably we should take a look at Lareau's concept of concerted cultivation, which is basically a middle class or an upper class parenting style that actively involves fostering and assessing a child's talents, opinions, and skills through organized activities and extensive reasoning and negotiation. We can contrast that with a sort of natural growth Rousseauian model almost, where the child's learning is basically expected to be coming from nature or the just normal interactions, and the relationship between child and parent is definitely one that's more of a top down authority, where instead of basically encouraging children to be a bit more agentic, um, parents especially essentially just issue directives to their children and expect them to follow them rather than having like a negotiation process. So, um, the chapter that we had assigned, for those of you who are not familiar with sociology and its methodology, um, basically this book contains an ethnography, which essentially is the process of somebody who's a social scientist, usually, especially, going out into a community, interacting, observing with different people, especially around sort of a group that they're interested in, and basically recording all of those interactions. After they do that, they take that record back with them and they reflect on it. And usually that reflection is in the form of a number of articles or like a book. And so the chapter that we're reading is about a particular family that Lareau actually talked to and met with, that she calls the Handlin family. And in Lareau's opinion, the Handlins have all three forms of Bourdieu's capital. They have economic capital, social capital, cultural capital, and the head of the head of sort of the domestic side of the Handlin family is Miss Handlin, who is trying to activate um, the social and cultural capital for Melanie to make sure she has a good life and the standard of living that they have. So basically, that takes two approaches. The first of which is intervening at school. Miss Hanlon basically feels entitled to critique teachers, especially if she feels like their teaching methods aren't effective for her daughter. She requests spelling lists because she's interested in what the expectations of the class or the school are. So she's trying to learn that way to make sure that Melanie is on the right track. And finally, she's advocating for her daughter's self esteem. Uh, on the home front, I guess we could say there's also an intervention going on within the Handlin household. That takes the form of intense daily homework battles, and Miss Hanlon's help is a form of concerted cultivation, but I think we could definitely um, take this particular example as one that maybe has potentially gone awry, because it's exhausting for both Miss Hanlon and Melanie, and it's been yielding few academic profits. But what it is doing is reinforcing a specific relationship between authority and institutional intervention. So I think Lareau's conclusion here is particularly important for our understanding of um, cul- cultural and social capital as well as meritocracy as a whole. And that is that activating this sort of cultural social capital doesn't necessarily guarantee success. External factors like a child's own disposition, the shrewdness of the intervention, and the school's reception all play a role in whether or not a child is going to be successful. And I think this helps to both nuance Bourdieu as well as our own understanding of meritocracy. And I think Sandel mentions this a little bit too, because just because um, some people are able to make it without any sort of like external um, kind of support network doesn't necessarily detract from kind of an overall assessment of kind of the average situation. And consequent, on the flip side, Melanie's example, which we don't know exactly how she ended up, but in this particular situation, it seems like the family is not necessarily being successful in transferring some of the benefits that they have to her. So I think we can see kind of both sides here making the argument a little bit more gray and a little bit less black and white. And I think the big takeaway though is that the family is the first site where class-based advantage or disadvantage is going to be realized. And that means that concerted cultivation, or this concept, is basically training children to interact with institutions in ways that the institutions are primed to reward. Um, so, next, let's take a look at the school front, and we can do that with Jean Anyon's reading about hidden curriculum. And what hidden curriculum is essentially is the implicit social messages and behavioral norms transmitted through the structure of schooling, which are preparing students for different roles in the social hierarchy. And I think it's important to note that different schools can have a different set of hidden curriculum. And we see that play out in this article as Anyon identifies 5 different types of schools. And I think we can sort of see the sorting machine, quote unquote, in action here at an elementary level and not just at a college level. So the first school for us to look at is the working class school. Now, work is about following procedures. It's mechanical, it's rote, and it emphasizes compliance. This is a sort of like traditional idea of education that a lot of education reformers have sort of had beef against. You know, Dewey's critiqued it. Um, Mann even sort of critiqued it. Um, and I think, one example for this that we might want to think about is just like the idea of maybe like PEMDAS. Perhaps in a working class school, students might be told to follow PEMDAS, to remember it, but they're not necessarily going to be told why it's important to uh, do so. They're going to kind of be given the what without the why. Um, and I was actually kind of curious about this because I don't know if I ever necessarily remembered it. I think I was told the what, but when I was reading about PEMDAS, it was explained to me that it's sort of like a grammar for math. And the reason why we all follow this sort of order of operations is because we all need to have a shared structure or method to interpreting a mathematical equation. That way we can all get the same results. So the reason is basically we all need to have a shared understanding of why we're approaching it a certain way. So next off, let's look at middle class schools. And Anyon says that in middle class schools, work is about getting the right answer. It's not just necessarily following rules, but there is some choice in figuring it out, but the goal is still usually about finding a predetermined correct answer. We can contrast that with more affluent schools or professional schools where work is more about being schoolwork, is more about a creative activity and independent expression. And there, students are asked to apply ideas, create products, and interpret reality. And finally, we have sort of the elite schools, usually private schools, where work is about developing analytical intellectual power and conceptualizing systems. And the goal here, Anyon says, is about preparing students for leadership and control. So I think the takeaway for us from this reading is that schools are not necessarily neutral, and nor do they provide a uniform education across each institution. They educate in different ways and can affect relationships to capital, authority, and work based on the type of student that they may cater to. Anyon says this is because they're training children for what will probably be their future economic roles. So, how can we put Lareau's case study and Anyon's case study together into a bigger picture? Our third reading from Bowles and Gintis, I think, provide us with a bit of a framework to do so. And their core concept is the correspondence principle, which is basically an argument that says the secret behind Social relations within US education lies within the economy. And essentially, that means that we can find all sorts of parallels between the education system and the economic system. And essentially, they correspond. So we can take one example, which is the teacher instructs the student, and the student follows those instructions. Likewise, a boss gives orders or instructions, and the worker follows those instructions. Similarly, the student or worker is motivated by external rewards. Those could be grades in the case of a student, or wages in the case of a worker. And these are not things that are of intrinsic, they're not intrinsic to the actual process that they're engaged in. That means that, like, a grade is an external thing as opposed to the actual learning, which is what education, we would hope, does. And similarly, within work, you get paid for your labor, but you don't necessarily have like an interest in what you are doing with that labor. So, for example, like if you're building a car and you're working in a factory, you're doing it because you're getting paid. You're not doing it because you love building cars necessarily. Um, Similarly, um, the curriculum in education can often be alienating to students. It can be fragmented, just like how work can be alienating and fragmented to individuals. Basically, like they may find it devoid of meaning. They don't may not understand like what the purpose of what they're learning is or what they're doing is. And finally, competition among students and workers is encouraged. So, how do we see this sort of comparison play out in the other two readings that we've just kind of discussed? So, I think for Anyon, we can see that the different hidden curricula that Anyon found are the correspondence principle in action. The working class school corresponds to the factory floor, and the elite school is corresponding to the corporate boardroom, where, like like we said, they're much more interested in sort of like abstract strategy decisions, whereas a working class school is much more interested in a top-down authority process, and uh, essentially you should just remember what you're taught and not question it. Um, Similarly, I think in Lareau, we can see that the family, through practices like concerted cultivation, is the primary institution that is preparing the child to slot into a corresponding part of the school system. And the Handlins are trying to prepare Melanie for a middle class school and a middle class future, but she's having individual struggles, and the school's resistance is showing some friction in that system. So finally, I think we should note that Bowles and Gintis are arguing that the system reproduces not just inequality, but the sort of consciousness itself, like the idea of what is normal. And it makes the sort of division of labor feel very normal and inevitable when you go from a school system that kind of treats you in a very authoritative way to a work relationship where you have a boss, when you used to have a teacher and the boss tells you what to do and you have to do it. And how do these readings help us understand the relationship between social class and education? Well, I think, first of all, families instill class specific dispositions and resources. So that's a cultural capital angle from Bourdieu as well as Lareau. Second, schools receive children, and through a hidden curriculum, they further sort and train them for a class specific future, and that's Anyon. And then finally, the whole process corresponds to the needs of our economy, which needs different kinds of workers and managers. And that was Bowles and Gintis. And that's sort of like a social efficiency angle as well. So, coming back to Labourie's goals, we sort of have this cross between social mobility and, how realistic is it with this sort of return to the social efficiency idea as well. And I think this trio of readings presents a pretty powerful critique of our education system. We sort of started last week with a really high lens, zoomed out view, kind of just talking about meritocracy and society generally. But this week, the readings really suggesting that educational inequality is not an accident or a simple matter of some families not valuing education, and rather it's baked into the sort of everyday logic of our major social found institutions. Um, if Sandel and Bourdieu showed us that the idea of social mobility and meritocracy might be flawed, I think this week's readings show us how the specific mechanisms within society maintain that same equilibrium of some coming out on top with more remaining on bottom. And I think the question for us educators, students, and citizens is, what are we supposed to do if this is all true? um, I encourage you guys to sort of think through this, but as we reach sort of the end of this class, there are going to be some possibilities potentially brought up. So put a pin in that. So thanks, guys, for listening. Hope this was helpful, and I'll see you again soon.